Some stories don't arrive with breaking news alerts. They don't scream for attention. They simply appear and wait for those who know how to look. Over the years, I've learned something important. When events seem unrelated, when headlines feel scattered, that's usually when something deeper is happening underneath. A public figure appears with a visible bruise. The media reacts instantly. Some dismiss it as nothing. Others turn it into speculation. Almost at the same time, a sudden call for peace is announced. A formal board, a serious name, strong words about unity and stability. And then, in a completely different corner, humor enters the picture. Not loud comedy, not jokes for applause, but sharp, carefully chosen words that make powerful people uncomfortable. At first glance, none of this seems connected. But if you've lived long enough, you know better. Power doesn't always move loudly. Sometimes it moves quietly, through timing, symbols, and carefully shaped narratives. I'm not here tonight to accuse anyone. I'm not here to defend anyone either. This isn't about taking sides. This is about understanding how influence works in moments like these, how perception is shaped, how stories are guided, and how public attention is redirected without most people even realizing it. Those of us who've seen a few decades understand something younger voices often miss. Real shifts don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves slowly to those who are paying attention. So tonight, let's slow down. Let's look past the noise, and let's ask a simple, honest question. Are these just coincidences, or are we watching a carefully timed sequence unfold right in front of us? When people reach a certain age, they stop being impressed by noise. They've heard promises before. They've seen headlines come and go. What begins to matter instead is pattern, timing, and intention. That is why some moments, which look small on the surface, quietly demand attention from those who have lived long enough to recognize the signs. A visible bruise on a powerful figure is one of those moments. By itself, it means very little. Anyone can trip. Anyone can fall. The human body is not a machine, and age makes that truth harder to ignore. But public life changes the meaning of ordinary things. In politics, nothing exists in isolation. Appearance becomes message. Timing becomes language. Those who have spent decades observing leadership understand that strength is rarely measured by words alone. It is measured by how weakness is handled, by how quickly the narrative shifts, by what follows next. At a younger age, people tend to focus on what happened. As experience grows, the question changes. Not what happened, but why does this matter now? Because timing is never accidental in serious power. A bruise appearing during a moment of political pressure is not dangerous because it signals physical vulnerability. It is dangerous because it invites interpretation. Supporters rush to explain it away. Critics rush to magnify it. Media outlets frame it according to the expectations of their audience. And somewhere in the middle, the original fact disappears beneath layers of meaning. Those who have lived through multiple political cycles recognize this immediately. The event itself becomes irrelevant. What matters is what it allows others to say. This is where experienced leadership reacts differently from inexperienced leadership. The goal is not to deny reality. Denial rarely works. The goal is to replace the frame, to move the conversation somewhere safer, somewhere more dignified, somewhere that restores authority without confrontation. And this is often where language like peace, stability, and unity enters the picture. A call for peace carries weight, especially when it comes from someone who has spent much of their public life surrounded by conflict. It signals maturity, reflection, a desire to rise above the noise, to speak not as a fighter, but as a statesman. For an older audience, this resonates deeply because life itself teaches this lesson. Endless battles exhaust everyone. At some point, the question is no longer who is right, but what remains after the fight is over. That is why initiatives framed around peace often appear later rather than earlier. They are not the language of ambition. They are the language of legacy. And legacy matters most when time becomes visible. Those who are young rarely think about how they will be remembered. Those who have crossed a certain threshold cannot avoid the question. It appears quietly, not as fear, but as awareness. What story will remain when the noise fades? Peace, as a concept, offers a powerful answer. It reframes past conflict as necessary struggle. It presents the present as wisdom earned, and it gestures toward a future that feels calmer, more controlled, more dignified. But people who have lived long enough know something else as well. Peace is one of the most effective narrative tools in politics. Not because it is false, but because it is unquestionable. No one can argue against peace without sounding unreasonable. That gives it a unique power. This does not automatically make such initiatives insincere. Human motives are rarely pure or impure. They are layered. A leader can genuinely desire peace and still understand its strategic value. These things are not mutually exclusive. What matters is not whether peace is good. That is obvious. What matters is what problem the language of peace is responding to in that moment. And that question brings us back to perception. A visible bruise invites doubt. A peace initiative restores seriousness. It shifts attention away from physical vulnerability and toward moral authority, away from speculation and toward vision. This is not deception. It is communication. Anyone who has managed people, organizations, or even families understands this instinctively. When a situation begins to drift, you do not argue every detail. You change the direction of the conversation. Politics operates on the same human principles, just on a larger scale. But while official power works through speeches, boards, and formal language, there is another force that operates very differently. A force that does not ask permission and does not follow traditional rules. That force is humor. For a long time, humor was treated as entertainment, a way to relax, a way to escape. But over the years, it has become something else, a mirror, a pressure valve, a way of saying what others cannot say directly. Those who have lived through different media eras have seen this evolution clearly. There was a time when criticism came mainly through newspapers and formal debate. Today, it often comes wrapped in laughter. Humor has a unique ability to bypass defenses. It reaches people emotionally before they can react intellectually. By the time the message is understood, resistance has already softened. This is why humor unsettles authority. Power depends on seriousness, on being taken at face value, on maintaining a certain distance. Laughter collapses that distance. It makes the powerful seem ordinary, fallible, human. And when people stop fearing authority, authority begins to feel pressure. This is where regulation enters the story. Regulatory institutions exist to create order, not to manage jokes. But when humor starts shaping political understanding, lines begin to blur. Questions arise about responsibility, about limits, about what should be allowed. To an inexperienced observer, this may look like censorship or overreach. To an experienced one, it looks like something more familiar, a system responding to discomfort. Those who have lived long enough recognize this pattern immediately. When power feels stable, it tolerates criticism. When it feels uncertain, it tightens boundaries. This is not a moral judgment. It is a historical observation. Every era has its version of this tension between expression and control, between freedom and structure, between laughter and seriousness. The mistake many people make is treating these tensions as battles between good and evil. That framing may feel satisfying, but it rarely leads to understanding. Those with experience see something different. They see a balancing act, an ongoing adjustment, a system trying to maintain equilibrium in a changing environment. The Bruise, the Peace Initiative, and the growing sensitivity to humor are not isolated events. They are signals, indicators of a system under pressure, responding in familiar ways. None of this requires secret coordination. It does not require conspiracy. It emerges naturally from incentives and human behavior. Public figures want stability. Institutions want order. Comedians want relevance. Audiences want meaning. These forces interact constantly, shaping the stories that rise and the ones that disappear. The danger is not that any one of these forces exists. The danger is reacting to them emotionally instead of understanding them structurally. This is where age becomes an advantage. Those between 45 and 65 have lived through enough moments like this to recognize when emotion is being invited, when urgency is being manufactured, when attention is being redirected. They know that real change rarely announces itself loudly. It moves slowly through adjustments in tone, language, and expectation. That is why this moment matters. Not because of the bruise itself, not because of the peace board by itself, not because of jokes or regulations by themselves, but because together they show how modern power manages uncertainty, not through force, not through silence, but through narrative. Understanding this does not require anger. It requires patience. And patience is something experience teaches better than anything else. With time, one begins to notice that power rarely collapses all at once. It doesn't fall with a loud crash or a dramatic ending. Instead, it adjusts. It reshapes itself. It learns how to survive under new conditions. This is something only those who have lived through decades of political change truly understand. Systems do not disappear easily. They evolve. This is why moments like the one we are witnessing now deserve careful attention. Not because they are shocking, but because they are revealing. A bruise, a peace initiative, and a growing sensitivity to humor may appear unrelated to many. To the experienced observer, they feel familiar. They resemble earlier transitions, earlier recalibrations, earlier attempts to regain balance when certainty begins to slip. At this stage of life, people no longer expect perfection from leaders. What they expect instead is composure, control, a sense that someone understands the weight of the moment. When that expectation is threatened, even slightly, the system responds. That response is rarely direct. Instead of confrontation, we see redirection. Instead of denial, we see reframing. Instead of force, we see language. Language is one of the most underestimated tools of power. Words like peace, responsibility, and stability do more than describe intentions. They signal maturity. They reassure those who are tired of conflict. They speak directly to people who have lived long enough to know how destructive endless division can be. But language also performs another function. It organizes perception. It tells people where to look, what to focus on, and what to ignore. This is not manipulation in the dramatic sense. It is something far more ordinary and far more effective. It is agenda setting. When attention moves toward peace, it naturally moves away from vulnerability. When conversations turn toward legacy, they move away from speculation. When seriousness returns to the foreground, humor becomes easier to question. This is how systems stabilize themselves. Those who lack experience often interpret this as dishonesty. Those who have lived longer recognize it as adaptation. Neither view is entirely wrong, but only one leads to understanding. Understanding requires stepping back far enough to see the pattern, not just the moment. Humor complicates this process because it resists control. It does not follow the usual channels. It does not respect hierarchy. It exposes contradictions without offering solutions, and that is precisely why it unsettles authority. Humor doesn't argue, it reveals. A joke doesn't demand agreement. It invites recognition, and recognition can be more dangerous than opposition. For people who have spent decades building systems of influence, recognition without control feels risky, not because humor itself holds power, but because it spreads freely. It does not require trust in institutions. It only requires shared understanding. This is why boundaries begin to matter. Regulation, in this context, is not simply about rules. It is about reassurance. It signals that someone is still in charge. That lines exist. That order remains. Those who have lived through multiple eras of regulation understand this instinctively. After periods of cultural looseness, systems tighten. After periods of control, they loosen again. This cycle repeats. The mistake is believing that any one phase represents a permanent truth. It never does. What we are witnessing is not the end of free expression, nor the collapse of authority. It is a negotiation, a recalibration, a search for equilibrium in a changing environment. And this negotiation does not happen in speeches alone. It happens in symbols, in timing, in tone. A bruise reminds the public that leaders are human. A peace board reminds them that leaders think beyond the present. Sensitivity to humor reminds them that words still matter. None of these signals exist in isolation. Together, they shape how authority is perceived. For the mature viewer, this raises an important question. Not who is right, but what kind of stability is being pursued. There are different kinds of stability. One is built on fear, another on trust. One relies on force, another on consent. Most modern systems attempt a combination of all four. The balance shifts depending on circumstance. Those who have lived long enough know that pure stability is an illusion. Change is constant. The real question is whether change is guided or chaotic. Peace initiatives suggest a desire for guidance. Regulation suggests a desire for order. Humor suggests resistance to rigidity. Each force pushes against the others, and out of that tension, a temporary balance emerges. The danger lies not in any single force, but in losing the ability to think clearly about them. This is why experience matters so much in moments like these, because experience teaches restraint. You don't need to defend everything. You don't need to attack everything. You don't need to react immediately. You can observe. Observation is not passivity. It is discipline. Those who observe carefully notice that public discourse today moves faster than understanding. Headlines change before questions are answered. Opinions are formed before facts settle. This speed benefits those who control narratives. It disadvantages those who seek truth. Slowing down becomes an act of independence. For the 45 to 65 audience, this is not new. You have lived through moments when certainty collapsed overnight, when confident predictions failed, when loud voices disappeared quietly. You have seen how history reevaluates what once seemed obvious. That memory is a form of protection. It allows you to resist being pulled into emotional extremes. It allows you to recognize when urgency is being used as leverage. It allows you to separate signal from noise. In this moment, the signal is not any single headline. It is the convergence of multiple adjustments, a public figure managing perception, a system seeking stability, a cultural force pushing boundaries, each responding to the same underlying pressure, uncertainty. Uncertainty is uncomfortable. It demands response. But response does not always mean action. Sometimes it means interpretation. Those who understand this do not rush to conclusions. They ask better questions. They ask how narratives are being shaped. They ask who benefits from certain frames. They ask what is being emphasized and what is being quietly set aside. These questions do not lead to outrage. They lead to clarity. And clarity is rare. As time moves forward, this period will be simplified. Future summaries will reduce it to a few sentences, a few labels, a few judgments. But those who live through it will remember the complexity, the ambiguity, the feeling that something was shifting, even if it was hard to name. That feeling is not confusion. It is awareness. Awareness does not demand certainty. It tolerates doubt. It understands that most transitions are only clear in hindsight. The role of the experienced observer is not to predict outcomes. It is to remain grounded while others are pulled by emotion. That is not a small role. It is a stabilizing one. Because societies do not fall apart when leaders stumble or jokes offend. They falter when people stop thinking. Thinking requires space, calm, distance, and those qualities are more valuable now than ever. So when you see these stories unfolding, resist the urge to compress them into simple conclusions. Resist the pressure to choose a side immediately. Resist the temptation to turn complexity into slogans. Instead, do what experience has prepared you to do. Watch carefully, listen patiently. And remember that power, like people, reveals its true nature not in moments of confidence but in moments of adjustment. That is where the real story always is. When all the noise fades, what remains is not the headline, but the pattern. Those who have lived long enough understand this instinctively. History rarely moves in straight lines, and it almost never announces its intentions clearly. It reveals itself slowly, through small signals that only begin to make sense when we step back and look at them together. A bruise by itself means very little. A call for peace by itself sounds admirable. Humor by itself feels harmless. But when these elements appear at the same moment, they invite reflection, not panic, not outrage, reflection. This is not about deciding who is right or who is wrong. It is about understanding how power responds when uncertainty enters the room, how narratives are shaped, how attention is guided, and how public conversation is quietly redirected. Those of us who have reached this stage of life know that stability is fragile. It depends not just on institutions, but on the quality of thinking within society. When people stop asking questions and start reacting emotionally, balance is lost. When people slow down and observe, balance has a chance to return. The real responsibility does not belong only to leaders or institutions. It belongs to the public as well. To those who listen carefully instead of loudly. To those who value understanding over instant judgment. So the question I leave you with is a simple one, not a slogan, not a demand, a question worth thinking about. Do you believe this is the right way to handle moments like these? Do you think peace initiatives, narrative control, and limits on expression create stability? Or do they create new tensions? Should power be challenged more openly or managed more carefully? There are no easy answers, but thoughtful opinions matter. I'd genuinely like to hear your perspective. Share your view in the comments, respectfully and calmly. Experience deserves space in this conversation, because in times like these, the most valuable voice is not the loudest one. It is the most thoughtful.